One of the things I've long spoken out about is how feminism hurts women as much as it does men. Feminists for years have propagated myths and false realities to try and scare women because in their mind it benefits and furthers their agenda to do so. And in this video, which is going to be a bit disturbing to some people, I'm going to share a perfect example of just that.
Do you know how hard it is to be convicted of rape?
Well, actually, I do because I've done extensive research on the matter. And anyone who has and gotten past all the hyperbole and bias that's being used to try and portray a myth will understand that it's not as hard as is usually presented, because usually they'll say something like this.
That's why less than 2% of rapists are actually convicted.
Now look, before I get into this any further, I'm not trying to dismiss the trauma that women and men go through when they're a victim of a sexual assault. And I myself am a victim. The woman that assaulted me was never charged, let alone convicted. When I went to the police to report it, they refused to even consider taking that report, something that has happened to literally millions of men over the years. What happened to me shows up nowhere in the statistics, which is why you need to question said statistics, because many times those statistics are manipulated to pursue an agenda, not show actual fact. And then they're quoted as gospel when in fact they're anything but. It's not helping any victim to spread misinformation such as this. Because you see, that 2% quote she just quoted as fact was the result of a U.S. Senate Judiciary report from 1993, over 30 years ago. A report and the data within, which by the way, was called into question even then. Because you see, when they created that report and many subsequent ones to it, they like to factor in what they call unreported attacks. And they'll assign numbers often pulled out of nowhere, which are then used to inflate, or in this case, deflate, the actual conviction rate. In fact, if you go look at the website for the Central Minnesota SA Center, they specifically state on there that they have to factor in unreported assaults to come up with a number of 6% of actual assaulters spending time in prison. But nowhere on that website do they specify where they got that number of unreported assaults. Interestingly enough, when you look at the actual numbers from the reported cases, they tell a completely different story. For example, if an assault is reported, if the arrest is made, there is an 80% chance that it will be prosecuted. And if there's a prosecution, there's a 58% chance of a conviction. Now, many will argue that those numbers still seem low. And I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on that in this video. But I remind you, false allegations are rampant. But I've interviewed multiple members of law enforcement and the legal profession on my podcast who have all stated that false allegations are at an all-time high. And as one investigator told me, a female investigator at that, she's finding anywhere from 70 to 80% of the cases she's investigating are false allegations. And when you factor that into the numbers, especially the resulting 58% conviction rate, it indeed tells a different story than what's being portrayed. It's a far cry from the 2% the woman in the video quoted as fact. Again, we're not trying to dismiss the trauma that actual victims are going through, but this is a beautiful example of how the feminist narrative hurts women, because telling them that it's only 2% conviction rate is going to discourage actual victims from reporting their crime. And I've had actual victims tell me exactly that. Which leads me to the next part of her video where she says,
which tells me that this argument is always being made in bad faith.
Now I agree with her there. There is an argument that's being made in bad faith. Her argument, because again, she's trying to scare women. Her goal, indeed the goal of feminism for decades now, has been to create a paradigm where women literally fear walking down the street every minute of every day. Again, that does not help women. It hurts them. And oh, by the way, they conveniently say that argument doesn't apply for men. Yet if you looked at it, men get attacked by women and assaulted every single day. So pure logic would say that by definition, men should also be afraid of all women. And thus all women should be presumed to be ones that may attack a male until proven otherwise. An argument they've made about men for decades now. Again, they don't want to have that discussion, do they? Because again, it doesn't suit their agenda. An agenda whose goal is to divide men and women as much as possible, which doesn't help women it hurts them. And it leads to things like this.
Men who say things like this will never not give me grapist vibes.
Grapist vibes. In other words, she's labeling him as a potential grapist. That is, in fact, a false allegation that she's making, one based solely on one comment that this man made on a video. She's never met him, never interacted with him, but has decided to label him as a grapist simply based on her vibes. And if you look at the comments on that video, she got a bunch of other women to agree with her. It is the epitome of a false allegation and how feminists will weaponize them to try and silence any man, or any woman for that matter, that goes against their narrative, which again, doesn't help women, it hurts them. And it shows that no man is safe around her, because if she's going by her vibes, she's capable of coming up with any lie she needs to tell against any man she chooses to try and get back at, which again, does nothing to help women, especially women who are victims of assaults. As I've said repeatedly, we need to focus on bringing help to those who are assaulted. And furthermore, bringing to justice those who have attacked them. But this paradigm that she and others are trying to create does not help victims. It leads to unwanted and unwarranted investigations based on false allegations. It leads to actual victims not reporting their attacks because they don't think they'll get said justice. And it shows that they have no boundaries. They're willing to use those poor victims and the trauma they suffered as a tool, not to help the victims, but to just simply pursue their agenda of hate.